Hello, welcome to 31 Days Down the Red Rabbit Hole. I'm author Andreina Cordani, and you may have read my books, The 12 Days of Murder, or Murder at the Christmas Emporium, or my upcoming book, A Scrooge Mystery. So, I'm here down the Red Rabbit Hole to talk to you about the grimness of Victorian graveyards. A Scrooge Mystery is set in Victorian times, exactly 1 year after the original Christmas Carol story, and so I was really keen to include a graveyard scene as creepy as the one Dickens wrote. So that sent me off down my own red rabbit hole of horrors, down learning about Victorian cemeteries. And they are every bit as grim as Gothic fiction, possibly even grimmer. So bad, in fact, that I'm going to warn you that some of these stories are genuinely disturbing. So here are a few of the stories about Victorian graveyards that I dug up. First of all, have you ever seen a grave with an iron cage over it? If you see a grave like this, it's easy to assume that it's to keep the vampires in, but that's just a happy side effect. It's actually to keep the grave robbers out. Thanks to our very silly habit of burying people in their best clothes and jewellery, grave robbing was a recurring problem. And if you take a moment to think about how desperate you'd have to be to dig up a corpse and nick its clothes, then that gives you a very small glimpse into the levels of poverty people experience in cities like London. But of course the most notorious reason for digging up bodies was to steal the corpse itself for medical science. Doctors were willing to pay for cadavers for medical research, and they didn't really ask a lot of questions about where they came from. So that fostered an industry in digging up the corpses of the recently deceased. The most notorious body snatchers were Burke and Hare, who operated in Edinburgh in the early 19th century. They were too lazy to dig up graves, and they decided to cut out the middleman and kill people themselves. They actually murdered 16 people. And their crimes were so notorious that for a long time Burke actually meant to murder someone. So Burke himself was publicly dissected after his hanging, and so many people tried to attend the dissection that there was a minor riot and the police ended up being called, and they had to establish a kind of queuing system. During the procedure, one of the doctors dipped his pen into Burke's blood and used it to write a few phrases, a lovely souvenir. Burke's skeleton was then displayed in a medical museum, and as far as I know, it's still there. There's also a book that's said to be bound in his tan skin. So I'd say that Burke and Hare were pretty much a product of their time, which brings me to the next graveyard fact. So St Pancras Churchyard is just behind where King's Cross is. It's a sort of quiet little refuge away from the busyness of King's Cross and Pancras Station. It used to be a very regular haunt for body snatchers, but in the 19th century it was decided that the dead were literally lying in the way of progress and must be moved to make way for the building of King's Cross and Pancras rail network. The task was assigned to a young architect's assistant, lucky him, who arranged for the bodies to be disinterred and buried mixed together in a big large pit, very respectfully. The gravestones were left behind, obviously, and they were arranged in a circular kind of pattern around the base of an ash tree that was planted in the centre, and the idea was it was going to be a kind of evolving memorial. One of the few to escape this indignity was Mary Wollstonecraft, whose grave remains close to the church and is still, very much visited by feminists today. But the young assistant who moved the bodies was the writer Thomas Hardy, and the tree is known as the Hardy tree. As far as I know, it's not there anymore, but you can still see the way the gravestones are arranged around the edge. As for the restless spirit of those disturbed bodies, well, maybe that's why the transport system goes wrong as often as it does. In Dickens's time, graveyards were completely unregulated. It was the Wild West before we actually had the term the Wild West. I don't know what they would have called it back then. But by Dickens's time, the graveyards were incredibly overcrowded. He actually himself said that London was in danger of being overrun by vast armies of the dead, and I think that is the closest that Dickens ever got to writing zombie fiction. Correct me if I'm wrong. The population of London had swelled drastically over the last few decades with the Industrial Revolution, and obviously they were rife with disease, overcrowding, mortality rates were incredibly high. One of the biggest historic graveyards in London was Bunhill Fields. The name is thought to be a corruption of Bonehill, because after the rebuilding of St Paul's Cathedral, they moved all the bones out of the ossuary there and they buried them out in Bun Hill Fields, creating a literal hill of bones so high that at one point it had windmills standing on it. Bun Hill Fields was 2/3 of an acre, just over 3,000 square metres, and one year during an epidemic, over 21,000 bodies were buried there. And even now, if you go and visit, it's just around the corner from my publisher, so I go often. You can see how crowded it is. Bun Hill is the resting place of many well-known figures like Daniel Defoe and William Blake, although the more you learn about Victorian burial practices, the more you wonder how much of them is still there. So graves were a multi-storey setup. In this Wild West world of burial, churchyards started to stack up taller and taller, with graveyards burying the dead one on top of each other, or on the other. So instead of just, having one body, one grave, you would have sometimes like 7, 8, 9, 10, up to 12 graves stacked on top of each other. Some artisans in the fields and some early Strand had originally been, the graveyards were sunken down from street level, but by the 1840s the ground level was level with first-storey windows of neighbouring houses, which you can imagine was absolutely delightful for the neighbours. In 1844, when they were inquiring into grave conditions in the city, a former gravedigger testified that when new bodies came in, they would simply dig up the old ones, chop up the coffins for firework, and break up the bodies with spades. Old bones were burned or sold off to make fertiliser. As you can imagine, the smell was not great, especially if bodies were being laid to rest in a crypt rather than interred in the ground. So the gardener J.C. Loudon recommended that coffins were weighed down with stone or lead as, and this is in his own words, a corpulent body is ready to burst the coffin even before being taken in from the house. In the public catacombs of the New London cemeteries, explosions have been known to take place, which made a terrible smell, such a terrible smell that the grave diggers had to be plied constantly with rum. And that's in this splendid book about Victorian London. So, yeah, it was not nice. In 1844, the congregation at Enon Chapel began to complain about the foul odours coming from under the floor during services. And the children at Sunday school used to talk about how the body bugs were plaguing them during their lessons. So Enon Chapel was small by London standards. The burial vault underneath it was 59 feet by 59 feet, which sounds fine until you think of the fact that over 16 years, 12,000 bodies were interred there. The Reverend Howes was the one who was in charge of the church, and he just continued to accept payment for burying bodies until it became unbearable. After the scandal broke, the chapel was forced to close, and the bodies were removed, or as the man who was clearing them called them, the waste was removed, which took some time apparently. The site was later bought by speculators who opened it as a ballroom, advertising it as dancing on the dead, threepence entry, no lady or gentleman admitted unless wearing shoes and stockings. There are some doubts about the exact numbers of people that were buried in that church, but it was scandals like this that led to reform and regulation. We often talk about how the Victorians were obsessed with death, and that's a whole other podcast in itself. But can you really blame them when they were surrounded by all of this? And that's all we have time for on this day. I'd like to thank you for being here in this dark little hole and remind you to follow the Red Rabbit Hole on social media. Do subscribe, as it costs nothing, and it does really support the podcast and make a big difference. And it encourages your usual hosts, NV Peacock and Lisa Shepherd, to continue with their mad ramblings on here. And of course, that's a great thing, and we want more of that. You can find my links in the show below, so please do take a look at my books if it sounds interesting. And happy Halloween!